This is BBC World News Today. Reporting from Washington, I'm Jane O'Brien. The headlines. On trial in Brazil, suspended President Dilma Rousseff is maintaining her innocence and urging lawmakers not to remove her permanently from power. Should migrants in France be allowed to apply for asylum in Britain before they reach the UK? And new research shows the Mediterranean diet has even more benefits. Could it now help people with heart disease? And 6 scientists spend a year in isolation. See how their experience could mean success for a future mission to Mars. The suspended Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff has been defending her record in office. At her impeachment trial, she said she'd been unjustly accused of breaking rules in managing the country's budget. While senators are due to vote later this week on whether to remove her from power. She says that would represent a death penalty for democracy. Our correspondent Aleem Makbul reports.
Arriving for what could be her last stand, Brazil's first female president. At her impeachment trial, she made a final attempt to fight off being removed from office in what she sees as simply a class war.
As with all elites, they don't want to follow the will of the people. They want to take over at any price.
Well, there are supporters of Dilma Rousseff outside the Senate as she speaks, but millions more around the country too who feel that she's being impeached unfairly. But the small numbers and relative lack of energy is a sign that very few have hope left that she'll survive this process. Earlier this year, thousands took to the streets, both for and against their president, in an illustration of just how divided Brazilian society is. Dilma Rousseff's been judged before. In her youth, she was jailed for fighting against a military dictatorship. But she rose to Brazil's highest office in 2010, receiving the presidential sash from her predecessor and mentor, the hugely popular Lula da Silva. But it was a dramatic economic collapse that led Rousseff's opponents to seize on an opportunity to push out of office her and the leftist Workers' Party. While many celebrated, others saw as an injustice the decision to suspend Dilma Rousseff when no corruption was directly linked to her. The trial now is all a big come-down after the feel-good factor of the Olympics. As some of the venues are dismantled, it seems a break for the Games helped persuade many Brazilians to move on from trying to save their president.
I think she's already out. I mean, nobody remembers her anymore. You know what I mean? They say Brazilians have short-term memory. They can't remember stuff that happens. They only remember what just happened.
But Ms. Rousseff says fighting is in her nature and she hasn't given up yet. In reality, before the week's out, she could be told she has to vacate the presidential palace. Aleem Makbul, BBC News in Brasilia.
Well, for the latest, we can now cross live to Brasilia and speak with the BBC's Julia Canero. Julia, the writing does look pretty much on the wall for Dilma Rousseff. What happens next?
Well, over the next couple of days, we're going to have the vote here in Senate, in the main room where the session's taking place right now. The senators will have a moment for a speech, each one of them, 81 senators, tomorrow and after tomorrow, to justify their votes. And if there is a 2/3 majority in favor of the impeachment, then President Dilma Rousseff is definitely removed from office, cannot finish her mandate, and then the interim president Michel Temer is the one to be officially named president and will finish the mandate that ends late in 2018.
Does this then draw a line under the corruption problems that Brazil has been grappling with?
Well, the corruption is very much in the middle of all that is happening here in Brazil and the political crisis that Brazil is facing. There's this massive corruption investigation that's going on here known as the car wash scandal that has revealed, implicated many political parties, top political figures in corruption in a bribery scheme that started at state-run oil giant Petrobras, and that has also led to lots of discredit for the Workers' Party, the party of President Dilma Rousseff. So it's quite complicated because even though some people who are in favor of impeachment want to imply that it's the fault of the Workers' Party, we do see that this is deeply ingrained in the political system in Brazil and in many other political parties. So people here don't really have a feeling that with the substitution, if President Rousseff is in fact confirmed, if the impeachment goes ahead, there's not really a feeling that that would bring any transformation to that problem we have here in the corruption problem and how big a part it is in the political world in Brasilia.
Well, Julia Canero with that update. Thank you very much for joining me. Now, there are calls for a new system to deal with thousands of migrants living in a camp near the French port of Calais, known as the Jungle. The president of the region says those seeking asylum in Britain should be able to apply at a hotspot in France. His comments come after two leading contenders for the French presidency called for changes to the treaty, which allows for UK border controls on French soil. Matthew Price has more from Calais.
Welcome to Fortress Calais, where fences and barbed wire stretch along the roads and the railways that lead to the ferries, the trains and on to Britain. Every day more are put up to stop people living here illegally crossing the channel. But there's only so much a fence can do. Calais' shantytown camp that's known as the Jungle is growing. Many here believe that part of the problem is the bilateral agreement known as Le Touquet that sees British border guards stationed in France. The president of this region says Le Touquet must change or end.
It's not possible to keep the border here without a new cooperation between the two governments. If British government don't want to open this discussion, we will tell you Touquet's agreement, that's over.
That's a threat, but he does have a solution. Migrants hoping to claim asylum in the UK should be able to do so at a hotspot in France. Could it work?
I think it's a terrible idea, partly because that's not how the asylum system works. You are supposed to apply in the country that you find yourself in. Secondly, I just think it would be a huge magnet to draw thousands more migrants to Calais who'd come to chance their arm that they might get through to the UK.
Mr. Bertrand's intervention highlights how important the issues of security, of borders, of migration have become here in France. He doesn't have the power to change the Le Touquet Accord, but the next French president will have that power. Elections are due to be held next year, and already two of the leading contenders for the post have said something needs to change. One of them, the former President Nicolas Sarkozy, spoke this weekend in Le Touquet. He said border controls should be shifted to Britain. The current French president, who recently met the Prime Minister, doesn't agree. He says the accord is in the interests of both their countries. But it doesn't feel like it on the roads leading to Calais, where smugglers block the route so migrants can stow away to Britain. Tomorrow, the Home Secretary Amber Rudd will be in Paris to meet her opposite number, and Calais will be on the agenda. Matthew Price, BBC News, Calais.
The US Pentagon spokesman says fighting between Turkey and Kurdish groups in northern Syria is unacceptable and must stop. They're urging both sides to focus on defeating so-called Islamic State. Well, Turkish troops backed by the United States crossed into Syria last week to drive IS out of Jarablus, a town close to the border. But they're now targeting Kurdish forces. But the Kurds are also considered to be allies of the US. Well, earlier, Turkey warned Kurdish militia that it will continue to be a target until it moves east of the Euphrates River.
Kurdish YPG should move immediately to the east of the Euphrates River, as they promised the United States and as they announced they would. So long as they don't, they will be a target. Arabs in Manbij and in that region are not targets. Our aim is to cleanse the area of Islamic State.
Turkish Foreign Minister there. Well, with me now to discuss the US reaction to the latest fighting is the BBC's Gary O'Donoghue. Gary, it's a bit of a tricky situation for the US, isn't it? Do they actually have any influence over the Turks at this point?
They do have influence, but it's a huge balancing act that they're doing. They're walking a tightrope here because on the one hand, they believe that the Kurdish forces, the YPG forces, they have been pretty capable fighters in the battle against the Islamic State group. The US has armed them, it's trained them, it regards them as perhaps the most organised of the groups in that area, and the US has failed previously to train its own force, so it's backing the Kurds a lot in them. But of course, its NATO ally Turkey is very suspicious of Kurdish operations, particularly along its southern border. It believes the Kurds are trying to join up some areas of Kurdish territory and have a whole kind of swathe of Kurdish territory along that southern border with Turkey. So that's why there's this conflict. It's not something that's a great surprise, to be honest, but it will require a lot of arm twisting by the US to stop them going at one another instead of going at the Islamic State.
Which is, of course, what the US is really concerned about. How much of a distraction is this in the fight against IS?
Well, it is a potential cause of fresh instability in an area that's already suffered pretty high levels of instability, quite honestly. Turkey is feeling slightly emboldened. Of course, it stopped that coup that was going to take place last month. It believes the US was slow to condemn that coup, so there's tension in the relations there between Washington and Ankara. And it also knows that perhaps the end game is perhaps starting to come into view in northern Syria, because now that places like Jarablus has gone, that Manbij has gone, the way is much more open to the Islamic State capital, Raqqa, which is the big prize, if you like, in the battle against IS in that northern part of Syria.
And of course, there must be a concern in the US that they also can't afford to upset the Kurds just as much as they have to keep Turkey on side.
Yeah, and the US needs both sides of this. It needs the Turks, it needs the Kurds in both these things, and that is where the conflict lies. So you're seeing at the moment in statements from the Pentagon, we're waiting for the Defense Secretary Ash Carter to speak as well, but you're seeing these statements that kind of try to balance these competing demands, saying Turkey shouldn't be shelling these areas where there's no IS fighters, and telling the YPG, the Kurds, to move back across the Euphrates River into that eastern part of northern Syria. So it's trying to ride two horses in this sense, and it's an enormously uncomfortable business here for Washington.
And deeply complicated. Gary O'Donoghue, thank you very much. Now let's take a look at some of the day's other news. And on a visit to Bangladesh, the US Secretary of State John Kerry has said that there's evidence that militants here also have ties with the Islamic State group. He was speaking after talks in the Bangladeshi capital with the Prime Minister. They agreed to cooperate to counter growing Islamic militancy. A daughter of the Uzbek president, Islam Karimov, says he's suffered a brain hemorrhage. Mr. Karimov, who's 78, has ruled the former Soviet republic since 1989. He's now in intensive care, where his condition is said to be stable. Now, in Yemen, doctors say more than 50 people have been killed in an attack in the city of Aden. A suicide bomber drove a car into the headquarters of a local pro-government militia. The Islamic State group says it was behind the attack. The BBC's Orla Guerin reports now from Egypt, and you may find some pictures in her report distressing.
The aftermath of a devastating attack in the early morning. The bomber struck at the headquarters of a pro-government militia. He drove an explosive-laden car in through the gate, turning the queue for breakfast into a scene of carnage. The so-called Islamic State said they carried out the attack, the latest in a series by both IS and Al-Qaeda. They've been expanding their reach in southern Yemen, exploiting the chaos caused by the country's civil war. A desperate rush to help the wounded. Dozens of casualties were brought to this hospital run by the aid group Doctors Without Borders. So many injured, they filled up the floor. One more round of bloodshed in a conflict which the United Nations says has killed about 3,800 civilians. But aid agencies say much of the suffering here goes unseen. When we visited in March, we saw the impact of war on the Arab world's poorest country. The conflict pits Yemen's internationally recognised government against Shia Houthi rebels who seized the capital in 2014. But there's Saudi firepower here too. Saudi Arabia intervened on behalf of the government and has been leading a controversial bombing campaign. The UN blames the Saudis and their allies for most of the civilian deaths. For the Saudis, this is part of a regional power struggle. They claim their great rival, Shia Iran, is arming the rebels. They remain in control of the capital, Sana'a. The latest round of peace talks collapsed earlier this month. There's now a new international push for more negotiations. But in the meantime, the human cost of this conflict keeps growing. Severe malnutrition, always a danger here, is tightening its grip. UN officials say that Yemen has been set back by decades. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Cairo.
More distress there in Yemen. Well, consuming large amounts of vegetables, nuts, fish and oils is characteristic of the popular Mediterranean diet, which has been shown to effectively reduce the chances of heart disease. Well, there may be even more benefits to this style of eating, with new research suggesting it could cut the risk of death even for those with heart disease. The BBC's Dan Johnson reports.
The key ingredients for a long and healthy life. We know a diet of vegetables, fish, nuts and olive oil is a good one, but now a claim it can even help beat heart disease.
The balance of fruit and vegetables means that there is extra vitamins and related compounds which are better for you. So it's a balance. The Mediterranean diet is genuinely, I think, more healthy in most of its components than, if you like, the standard British diet, which has got more fat, more meat.
1,200 patients who'd had heart attacks, strokes and blocked arteries were tracked over 7 years. The ones who followed a Mediterranean diet were less likely to be amongst those who died during the study. And healthier hearts are no surprise here at this Italian deli.
We use in our recipes a lot of vegetables and fruits, pasta, pizza, everything is from the ground.
We buy relatively healthy things. My wife is a bit of a fanatic on this front.
The grilled fish. Lovely meat dish. Big fan.
Cardiovascular problems account for more than a quarter of all deaths in the UK. That's more than 150,000 every year. So the hope is, by eating more like this, we may be able to prevent some of that disease and extend some of those lives. There's a claim Mediterranean cooking could be more effective than drugs like statins, widely prescribed for heart problems. The author of this study even said the NHS should prescribe vegetables before pills. Dan Johnson, BBC News.
The power of food there. Well, Hillary Clinton's closest aide says she's separating from her husband after a sexually explicit photo he allegedly texted to another woman appeared in a New York tabloid. In a statement, Huma Abedin said she took the decision to separate from former Congressman Anthony Weiner after long and painful consideration. Mr. Weiner resigned from Congress 5 years ago amid similar sexting allegations. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by the BBC North America reporter Anthony Zerka. Anthony, this has been a long-running scandal in Washington and New York. Tell us a bit about the background.
Yeah, Anthony Weiner back in the news again. We may forget now, but he was a rising star in the Democratic Party 5 years ago. He was in front of the cameras all the time as a member of Congress. Then he resigned, kind of rehabilitated himself, positioned himself to run for mayor of New York, ran for mayor of New York, and then another round of sexting came out. He ended up not doing well in that mayor's race, kind of disappeared. Now he's known mostly as the husband of Huma Abedin. And this, when it crops up again, it provides some sense of embarrassment for the Clintons. Bill Clinton actually officiated at their wedding. There's a documentary earlier this year that detailed all of the New York mayoral campaign again. So it's embarrassing, but not surprising, I suppose.
Well, he said he wouldn't do it again, but he apparently appears to have done it again. What sort of impact has this had on the campaign itself?
Well, Donald Trump has already come out with a statement. Also not surprising, Donald Trump loves to talk about whatever is in the TV news on the day, and he said it was careless of Clinton to associate with someone who had these ties. Huma Abedin, being married to Anthony Weiner, said that maybe secrets were coming from the Clinton campaign to Weiner, implying that he could have been blackmailed. Mind you, the ties that a presidential candidate has to advisors is fair game. It's happened 20 years ago. Dick Morris, he was an advisor for Bill Clinton, had to resign with a prostitution scandal. We're hearing a lot about Steve Bannon, who's Donald Trump's CEO of his campaign, about his ties, his allegations of wife beating during divorce proceedings. But this is one step more removed. This is the spouse of an advisor to a presidential candidate. So it's obviously big news right now. It's kind of a tawdry tale. It's the front page of the tabloids in New York. We'll see if it has any legs.
We certainly will. Anthony Zurcher, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Now, a bird taking to the skies might look like an effortless feat, but the science behind flight is actually quite complex. So much so that a team of scientists at Stanford University have designed a one-of-a-kind wind tunnel to learn more about how birds fly. It's part of a suite of experiments aimed at ultimately helping design flying robots that, with the same skills, our science reporter Victoria Gill had exclusive access to Stanford's flight lab.
The wonder of flight. Only in very slow motion can we see the minuscule adjustments this lovebird constantly makes to its flapping wings. Its tiny body has evolved perfectly to fly, and human engineers haven't come close to recreating that.
So here it is. It actually it's pretty big.
It's huge. That's something that researchers in this lab hope to change. They've dedicated an entire room at Stanford University in California to building this wind tunnel, the only one of its kind in the world.
Okay, so this is where you fly the birds?
Yes, so basically you can go in here
and it's starting to help them discover some of the bird's crucial secrets.
Wind tunnels have been used for a long time to study bird flight, but the new thing about this one is that with this device they can manipulate the airflow to recreate any environment on Earth, from a gusty city to the top of a mountain.
When you see a bird fly by in a city, you see all these small motions in the wing, and that's all it's doing to adjust to all the turbulence. And so it's really these tiny motions where they adapt quickly that make the difference. And we have no idea how they make these in response to which wind flow patterns.
In the moving air, the bird remains in one place, so exactly how it shifts as the airflow changes can be seen in unprecedented detail. But the team, with their specially clicker-trained birds, have also measured invisible characteristics of short hopping flights, like this one.
This setup is unique because it allows us to capture all of the forces that a bird generates from the moment it takes off to when it lands during one of these flights.
We have been able to record that actually most birds, when they fly, they generate twice as much lift during the downstroke to support their complete body weight, and then during upstroke they're actually in free fall.
So what can be done with all of this flight insight? The next generation of small-scale flying robots, or drones, will need to cope in unstable environments if they're to be useful in military or search and rescue applications. Currently, they simply can't manage as smoothly as birds. So these scientists will aim to create robotic copies of what nature has perfected over millions of years. Victoria Gill, BBC News, California.
Spending a year in Hawaii may not sound like a daunting task, but for 6 scientists living in isolation, it was not the island vacation you might expect. It was all part of a simulation showing that a mission to Mars could be successful. The team lived for 12 months in a dome on a Hawaiian volcano, chosen because its terrain is similar to that of the Red Planet. The BBC's Russell Trott reports.
A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, well, 365 days and in the Pacific to be exact, this team of intrepid explorers launched a simulated mission to Mars. The 6 men and women were taking part in a highly unusual experiment to boldly go where no one had gone before, to live long and prosper in conditions humans could expect on the Red Planet.
the UH research going up here is just super vital when it comes to picking crews, figuring out how people are going to actually work on different kinds of missions. It's sort of the human factors element of space travel, colonization, whatever it is you're actually looking at.
The scientists had to survive in isolation for a year in a dome on a volcano in Hawaii, without fresh air, fresh food or privacy.
Come on!
Back down to Earth, a warm welcome and some warm food. The study, funded by NASA and run by the University of Hawaii, is one of the longest of its kind. The inhospitable terrain chosen because it's similar to Mars and just as challenging.
Just showing that it works, you can actually get water from a ground that is seemingly dry. It would work on Mars, and the implication is that you would be able to get water on Mars from this little greenhouse construct.
The Martians of Hawaii say their experiment shows living in an isolated community millions of kilometres from Earth is humanly possible and no longer science fiction. Russell Trott, BBC News.
I guess it would be difficult to vote somebody off that island. And that's all from the programme. Next we have the weather. But for now, from me, Jane O'Brien, and the rest of the team, goodbye.